Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am coming at you from Coon Valley in Vernon County, Wisconsin.
Ooh.
I can already see Brother Chris who's our guest today. His wheels spinning, trying to call up relevant cephalogical data from the 1980s on this county. Unfortunately, not everybody can see this, but I thought I should show Chris my background. Here's my campfire.
Accurate. Nice.
And it's a sportsman's club, which is a glorified name for a campsite. And we are here doing the van life thing. And this is a proof of concept. So I want to do this with satellite service from the road. And so I needed someone who was used to indulging me and being generous of spirit. And I could think of, clearly Sarah Isger was not the person to have on to test this out. And so I have Brother Stirewalt, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, columnist for the Dispatch, and he is the amanuensis and major domo of this News Nation television network. And Brother Stirewalt, great to see you.
It is very good to be with you. And I have to wonder, I know and adore your wife. She is quite probably my second favorite Jessica in the world. But I wonder, what are the chances that she eventually murders you to stop this? What is it? I know she is a rugged Westerner, an Alaskan through and through, but it's a non-zero situation that you're going to get datelined eventually if you keep making her do this.
So it's interesting you say this because, if anything, the dynamic, it would seem to me the more relevant question would be, when will I kill her?
Oh, really?
Well, yeah. I mean, like, she's much more into outdoorsy stuff than I am, being an Alaskan and whatnot. And she's better suited to this. I'm enjoying it. I like it. It's fun. It's different. It's funny, though. And this is one of the things I want to talk to you about. And we will get to the punditry people. There's some people who don't like the inquisitive badinage that Chris and I sometimes engage in at the beginning of this podcast. And there are other podcasts for you to sample if that's a real problem for you. So, like, you probably know more about what I would say is what you might call geographic snobbery versus sort of class snobbery, right? You know, people who are, and snobbery is the wrong word, but it's sort of like, you know, like, I'll give you an example. Jess, I don't care how much money you have, what kind of 4-star dining you're used to, how many Charles Beard award-winning restaurants you've been to. My wife has stronger opinions about salmon than any of those people because she's from Alaska. They do a lot of salmon fishing, a lot of halibut fishing, and she has very strong feelings about it. It was interesting to me. We stayed at an RV camp. Trailer park's the wrong term.
Yes, please,
South
sir.
Dakota. Well, that sort of gets to the point. Is that we pull in, and I'm like, okay, so we're right next to these other people. That's not really the kind of thing we want to be doing, but it's late. We've driven a lot. This is fine. They got the right hookups. Whatever, the dogs will like it. And she was like, this is not what I envisioned about what we would be doing. We are not staying in an RV camp. And we got not an argument, and we decided to stay. I found it to be great. Like, I was very happy to be there. I kind of get Clarence Thomas's thing for doing this more. Sociologically, it was really interesting. Very nice people. People on one side of us were retired from Jacksonville, Florida, and they have been on the road intermittently for 3 years, ever since they sold their house. And I find that stuff fascinating. I like talking to these people. And so for me, like, the outdoorsy stuff is sometimes not as interesting as the human interaction kind of thing. But for Jess, is like, her family would consider camping something you do where there's not another soul for 50 miles, you know, that you were alone in the wilderness. And so she looks down her nose, not from a class kind of thing, but from, like, this is not authentic camping kind of thing. And anyway, it's an interesting distinction, I think. for
It is
New York jaded New Yorker.
It is funny that you mention that, because I've been thinking a lot about the semiotics of class and politics. My Jessica and I were at the Greenbrier, which is a lovely resort in southern West Virginia, last week. And when you leave the Greenbrier, you drive past actual Appalachia, right? You drive past trailers by the side of the road. You drive past you drive past the coal house made entirely out of coal.
It goes from 4-star resort to Appalachia
very quickly
once you leave the premises.
And I was thinking about how the weird college non-college split has come into American politics. So for people who are normal, prior to 2012, prior to 2008, certainly, having a college education was a lot less predictive of your voter preference or party identification than a lot of other things. Geography was more important. Age was more important. What we've seen now is that the college, non-college divide between Republicans and Democrats is just enormous. And as we were driving out, I noticed that one of the trailers had an Audi and I forget what other nice, and these were not beaters. These were in good condition in front of them. And I remembered something, which is that Boone County, West Virginia, always had the highest per capita income of any of the 55 counties in West Virginia. But if you drove through Boone County, you would think that you were in a very, very impoverished place. The reason is that the people in Boone County, West Virginia, prioritize different things. They have $75,000 trucks. They have $5,000 shotguns. They have ATVs. They have boats. They have whatever. Living in an old house or living in a modular home or a trailer home doesn't offend their sensibilities. If you work in a coal mine in Boone County, West Virginia, and you make $150,000 a year, you're rich, brother. Like it's low cost of living, low whatever. You're making more than someone who lives in Cincinnati and works as a college professor or an adjunct, somebody who works in academia. But that person drives a Volvo, and that person lives in a attractive home, and that person does that part. And I was thinking about how what the college non-college thing really says and what it's really doing is, I don't think it's that college is changing us politically. I think that college has become this powerful totem, this sorting, and Charles Murray writes about it in Coming Apart, and the trend has only intensified, which is it has become this very powerful class distinction that transcends income and transcends all this other stuff.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, two touch points on that. One is, in some ways, it was ever thus, right? I mean, we're talking about trends that are intensifying rather than like emerging de novo, because like the publishing industry in New York in particular was basically the modern equivalent of where you would put why you would send the second son in medieval Europe into the clergy. It's like you got to do something with them, and it's not embarrassing, and it's good social status. Doesn't pay very well, but and I think now the difference is that they're a whole, and those people could also live off of sort of accumulated capital of their families and their networks and whatnot and be fine. But it does point to how vulgar Marxist discussions of class have often missed out a lot of these cultural cues. The other thing I would say is so, on the advice of a lot of people, we listened to an episode of Acquired. Have you ever listened to this podcast?
I have not.
It's like almost like a business case study of specific companies, how they launched, why they were successful, that kind of thing. And a lot of people love it. We didn't love the hosts, the first one we listened to, but the story of Costco and Saul Price, who created it and all that, was very interesting. And one of the things that I thought was the most interesting is that Costco customers skew quite wealthy. I mean, they're not 1%ers per se, but they are like twice the median income of Walmart customers. And in part because bulk purchasing is actually something that affluent people do, right? And they have, not only can they afford to buy a huge amount, they can afford to store it someplace without it being embarrassing that they have a pallet of bottled water in their living room or whatever, right? And yet culturally, if you said in New York, you know, oh, those Costco shoppers.
Or even worse, Sam's Club. Even worse, Sam's Club.
Yeah. And anyway, it was sort of an interesting thing about how like the cultural tells and the economic tells don't necessarily jibe in the way that
how much does a poor American pay for an ounce of Diet Mountain Dew, and how much does a rich American pay for an ounce of Diet Mountain Dew? If you buy it 22 ounces at a time at a convenience store for $2.35, or if you go to Sam's Club, and by the way, while you're at Sam's Club, you will fill up your gas tank in your SUV at their gas station for 25 cents a gallon less than a gas station that's in a remote rural area or that's in a poor urban area. And
also, people who shop at Costco have second homes or boats or RVs, the things that they live
in. And we hate talking about class in American politics. We are racially obsessed. We push everything through race and gender. Every question of every election, of every public opinion, question of public opinion, we obsess over race and we obsess over gender. You live in Washington, D.C. In the District of Columbia and in nearby Prince George's County, there are stunningly affluent Black voters, right? There are some of the wealthiest Black people in the United States live here in the District of Columbia and its environs. And we can find differences politically with the rest of the country, but we don't really find differences with their neighbors, right? It's not like, so if you go to the Gold Coast in Northwest DC, one of the oldest, most affluent neighborhoods in Black neighborhoods in America, their white neighbors in the Palisades don't vote differently than they do. So one of the things, Americans are understandably reticent to talk about class, but a longtime hobby horse of mine is, when you see a statistic about Black voters or Black Americans or Hispanic Americans or any minority group, first say, if I just control for income here, what am I going to get? And very often, we saw this a ton during COVID. Black people are being afflicted by COVID more. Black people are not getting vaccinated at the same rate as the country as a whole. Okay. Well, unfortunately, Black people are overrepresented among the poorest Americans, right? There's an overrepresentation there. And then if we look at questions about crime, about public health, about all of these other things, if you just took the bottom two quintiles for income in the United States, you'd find that the Black-white discrepancies are a lot lower. And of the many unhealthy obsessions with race that we have in America, one of them is that we are always trying to put things in these terms, and it makes our politics stupider, and it makes us more fearful and more resentful of each other than is necessary. Because where you are in Wisconsin, there's a ton of poor people, right? You don't have to go very far to find poor people, and they're not different from poor people who live in Anacostia, and they're not different from poor people who live in Alabama, and they're not different from poor people who live in Southern California.
Although I looked it up, this county is like 11% Amish and Mennonite.
That's a great way to be poor. Different. That's of all the ways that you can be poor.
If you're going to be poor.
Well, my father used to say, and I believe very strongly in this, that the question to ask about what kind of mouse are you? Are you a city mouse or a country mouse? You say, if you were going to be poor, would you rather be poor in the city or poor in the country? And for me, it's obvious you want to be poor in the country because you want to be away from people, right? You want your best chance possible to be as far away from people and their fallen natures as possible. But for city people, they hear that and they say, I'd be away from services. There'd be no public transportation. There'd be nothing. I'd be out there. And one of my beliefs is we all like our own home cooking. We're all comfortable with the ick that we know, right? So if you take somebody from the Upper West Side of Manhattan and put them in Delbarton, West Virginia, they're going to be fairly appalled, right? They're going to be
You call this a bagel?
Exactly. This Dollar General has the worst lox I've ever tried. They're going to be appalled by the Appalachian squalor that they see. If I drive through Delbarton, West Virginia, I don't see it very much, right? It does not occur to me. Conversely, when I go to New York, the New Yorkness of New York is alarming to me, right? I'm bothered by it. Whereas somebody from New York says, of course there's a lunatic on the street wearing a diaper and banging on a pot running around. It's Wednesday. Of course there is.
That's my Uncle
exactly.
So this might be a slightly forced segue, but it might get
force it, brother.
Just like we talk about class and race in weird ways in this country, we talk about rural voters in really weird ways. And I drove through the hellhole that Tim Walz created yesterday. Like I said, Minnesota was very pretty, and did not have a lot of conversations about the governor, but the response from a lot of people is that he is this, or a lot of his defenders is that he knows how to reach out to rural voters. He came from a rural district where he did well, and the more you dive into it, it seems like that analysis makes the same mistake as a lot of those the rural rage thesis, where they're confusing sort of ex-urban, outer suburb cities with the guys from Deliverance or something. And what do you make of all that? I mean, like, I've seen data that says that he actually, when he ran for governor, he didn't perform any differently than any standard generic Democrat would.
He matched his district, which was a swing House district. And he gave the voters of his swing district what they wanted, right? He was a moderate. And then he got elected governor of Minnesota. And Minnesota, we've talked about many times, is not very democratic compared to the country as a whole, but it is extremely inelastic. Our rule-following Scandinavian brethren are not for turning, right? Other states are highly elastic. Georgia is a great example of a state that has a lot of swing in its numbers, and will elect simultaneously Brian Kemp, an extraordinarily conservative, as Mitt Romney would have said, a severely conservative governor, and Raphael Warnock, who is a very progressive, and they will do it. Yeah. And Minnesota, if you want to win in Minnesota, you better take care of your base. You better get that Democratic base locked down. And Tim Walz did. And he undertook something that hadn't been tried in Minnesota since the 60s and 70s, which was a progressive wish list, a absolute carnival of spending and regulation. He went for it because Minnesota Republicans had been playing it pretty close. When you think of Minnesota Republicans before, you're thinking of Amy Klobuchar, right? She's progressive. She's a grind on that stuff, but she also makes sure that she's keeping it in the middle of the Democratic Party, at least. Walz is the vice presidential nominee, and the person most likely to be the next vice president of the United States, because he sprinted to the left in his state. And he washed his hands of the old version and made himself appealing to the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party.
I'll have you know that I masterfully played Rudy Boschwitz in Model Senate in college.
You're a cool guy. You were a cool guy. The chicks were there. The chicks were there for sure.
Question. So states with a lot of electoral elasticity of the sort that you see with Georgia. I mean, when you compare Georgia and Minnesota, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, Georgia has had a massive amount of in-migration and demographic change. I don't know as much about Minnesota's demographics, but does stable population equal inelasticity while changing population doesn't? I mean, like Florida's electorate appears to have changed. This is the theory about Texas in a lot of ways, that it could change, right? You've compared it. You've basically said Texas is to Republican what Minnesota is to Democrat, but Texas has a lot of people moving.
Well, Texas not only
Minnesota doesn't.
Texas not only has a lot of people moving there, and more consequential for Texas electorally is that there are a lot of children being born in Texas. Texas is getting younger. And Minnesota, I haven't looked at Minnesota's median age numbers lately, and Minnesota has had a lot of in-migration. Somalis, we can go through the Hmong, the Somali. They've had waves of immigration because of Lutheran Charities and the generally helpful neighbor attitude of Lutherans in Minnesota, liberal Lutherans in Minnesota. And they have had lots of in-migration compared to other Rust Belt states, compared to Wisconsin, compared to Michigan, compared to Ohio. But in Texas, the danger for Republicans in Texas comes it comes from Californians. Sure, I hear you. But that's a self-selecting group of mammals, right? If you've left California, the idea that Texans have in mind of the danger to Texasism is that liberal Californians leave Marin County. The Kamala Harris clan leaves liberal Marin County and moves to Texas, and then gets there and tries to recreate California and Texas. There's a little truth to that. But remember, the people who are willing to go to Texas are going to Texas. Right. There's a handful of them that are being forced to move by their company and they don't want to go, and no doubt. But the big change in Texas is coming from the fact that younger states are more democratic. They're more progressive because younger people, and this has historically been true, and now it is bananas true, right? The split between liberal or democratic and not used to be, it's gradual. You can see it. You can see the line move over time. And the as we were talking about before with class, yes, by the time you get out to from the 20s to the 60s in age, you can see the migration of voters. But in the Trump era, the split has been intense, right? And younger voters are when we talk about the problems that Trump represents for Republicans, and there are many, it's been a short-term advantage in exchange for a long-term problem. The short-term advantage has been in places like rural Wisconsin. They Republicans connected with these voters in a way that they hadn't since maybe the progressive era, right? Since maybe Bob La Follette was representing Wisconsin, the elder, and reconnected to those working class voters in places like that. Republicans lost those voters to the Democrats for generations, and Trump brought them back with real intensity. When we look at Pennsylvania, Trump has outperformed and will outperform in 2024 any typical Republican in the T, right? The Pennsylvania the joke is that it's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in the middle. But basically you have the two metro areas in the southeast and the southwest corners of the state, and then the rest of the state is very red. And Trump will outperform any prior Republican of recent memory in the T. And that's a good way for Republicans to win. Unfortunately for Republicans, they've nominated this guy thrice. And the party's brand is now inextricably linked for I don't know how many cycles. I mean, it can happen pretty fast, right? If Trump loses this fall and the Republicans say, I don't even remember that guy. What? Who? Donald? What? I think I was a Haley voter. I don't recall. Right. Exactly. I remind people frequently that the distance from 1974 to 1986 was not huge, right? This was not an eternity. So yes, it can happen pretty quickly. But for the problem is, if you think about it as UV light, as the electorate matures, the wavelength of light that is hitting people as they're reaching the age of political ideation, what they're getting hit with. You and I both came of age at a time when the Republican brand was very clear, right? Ronald Reagan, the 1980 and 1984, 1988 elections. And the Republican brand was so clearly linked to Ronald Reagan that Republicans are still debating how much they should or should not like Ronald Reagan. That's kind of wild if you think about it. Democrats aren't talking about Bill Clinton. There's no like Bill Clinton, the cadaverous, reedy-voiced Bill Clinton who clomped on the stage in Chicago. People were, I was, because I'm weird, but people were not saying, what's the context of today's Democratic Party vis-a-vis Bill Clinton? Republicans still talk about Ronald Reagan, and that's because for a whole cohort of people who were kids and young adults in the 1980s, it was clear. It was clear what the brand was. You're bopping around the Midwest.
Yeah. So the original plan was to go to Utah.
I did listen to part of the Remnant, so I feel I'm aware of the fleeing the heat. You fled the heat.
Yes, and so we called an audible and decided to go to Door County, and the question is, Steve is a man of great enthusiasms, and so he's, he gets really caught up in things that he loves, and it's a charming Midwestern aspect of him. And it just dawned on me that maybe his affection for Door County is excessive, much like his affection for Spanish wine. And we'll get there and be like, this is nice. But,
it's really, really nice. It's really, really beautiful. There is no doubt that it is really, really beautiful.
Someone sent me an email saying that they call themselves the Cape Cod of the Midwest. And I'm like, I don't know what to make of that.
Anytime anybody says that there's something of the Midwest, I grow suspicious. Suspicious. The
it's
little
like Pomona
being
the Harvard of the East.
I was just going to say the Ohio University calls itself the Little Harvard on the Hocking. Say okay, fellas. Okay, you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, in 3, 2, 1. So Republicans have this William Jennings Bryan problem, which is if you keep nominating the same person over and over again, the radiation that you're hitting the electorate with for young people who are coming of age stays with them over time. They carry that signal with them as they move into adulthood. So you have a double whammy in a lot of ways of Barack Obama followed by Donald Trump gives you, it bakes in a lot of suppositions about politics with younger voters, and they carry some of that with them into adult life.
All right. We've had some connectivity issues, and I want to make sure that we get the toasted cheese sandwiches they talked me out of the first time. Get these snails off my plate. Where does the presidential race stand right now? Because, I have not been following it with the granularity that I've been known to issue, but I'm particularly out of the rhythms of things. I did not. I only saw clips of the interview. What where do you think things stand?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Jonah, because we're recording this on Tuesday, and my column for the Dispatch today, I attempt to, for a normal person, say, if you want to know where the race stands, this is where the race stands. And I focus here on, and you know my bias about polling, which is I try to ignore the large number of low quality polls that come out. And I try to focus on high quality polls. And high quality polls, there are other ways to do high quality polls. You can use probability models, and you can do that to have online. There are other things that can be done. But the most reliable way is still live interviewer, telephone calls to the appropriate number of landlines and cell phones with a demographically representative sample. And as I tell people every 2 years, the polls will be wrong, but we don't know by how much, and we don't know in which direction. Barack Obama was dramatically understated in 2012. Donald Trump was dramatically understated in 2016 and in 2020. 3 points for Donald Trump in 2016, 3.8 points in 2020. Barack Obama by about 2 points. Hillary Clinton was understated too, by the way. The polls missed a bunch of voters. And there's one way to think about those voters. You can focus on polling error and the question of why the polls are not exact predictors. Now, in 2020, Biden, the national polls got Biden right on the screws. They nailed him within a half a point. The average of high quality national polls put Biden within a half a point of his share. But again, significantly understated Donald Trump. So I look at it this way. It's not about how the polls are wrong. It's about what they tell us now about what's left over. And what's left over right now is about 6.8 points in average of voters who say Kamala Harris has a lead of 4 points or so. But there's 6.8 points, I think that's right, of voters who say they're voting for another candidate or say that they're undecided in the average. If we take out the share of the electorate that is probably going to vote third party, that's going to be something less than 2%, right? Less than something like 2%. 2016 is this hugely anomalous year in which Gary Johnson gets, at this point in 2016, Gary Johnson was hitting double digits for the Libertarians, and the electorate was very unsettled. At this point in 2016, 19% of the electorate was undecided or other. And that was historically high. But that number dropped right back down to the normal range in 2020. It went to 1.9% in 2020 of the electorate that in the end voted for a third party candidate, which is about the same as it was in 2012, which is about the same that it was in 2008, which is about the same that it always is. Those are just the protest votes. So if you back that out, that means that there's 5.7% of the electorate that is undecided or that is undecided if you give away that 1.9%. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, do you feel lucky? No, you have to ask yourself, what percentage of those voters are going to end up with Donald Trump, and what percent is Kamala Harris going to win? And the problem for Trump is, if he closes as strongly as he did in 2020, he can win. If he gets 75%, which is what he did in the last 9 weeks of 2020, if he gets 75% of what's left, he'll get it basically within a point. It'll be close. He'll win Pennsylvania. He'll win. And he might even win another upper Midwest state. But the problem for Trump is every point below that takes him closer and closer to oblivion. And for Kamala Harris, if she does as well as Hillary Clinton did in the closing weeks of 2016, if she gets a split, Hillary Clinton got a little more than half of what was left in 2016. If she does that, because she's starting from a higher baseline than Clinton did, if she does that, she'll win all of the upper Midwest states, and she'll win Georgia, Arizona, maybe North Carolina, right? There's a world in which Kamala Harris can close this race with a lead of more, with a national popular vote share of more than 4 points. And your handy dandy index is this: the swing states, the 7 swing states, are just a little more Republican than the nation as a whole. It's 1 point whatever points more Republican than the nation as a whole. That's why they're swing states. They're just a little less Democratic in a country that is majority Democrat. And we know why this is true, because the Democrats are the party of the big cities, and there's tons and tons of wasted votes in Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York and Boston, in states that are already going to be blue. Republicans have lots of wasted votes in Alabama and West Virginia and Oklahoma. But because of how many people live in those places, Democrats just have a national advantage in the popular vote. So if you want to keep track, let's say you're living in a van down by the river and traveling around the Midwest, let's say, and arising at 4 a.m. to walk dogs. Let's say you're doing that, and you want to know what the state of the race is. Look at the Democrats' number and subtract 2. And that'll tell you about where the Electoral College is. So Kamala Harris has to win. Hillary Clinton won by 2.02 points in the national popular vote and came up 1 frog hair short in the Electoral College in those states, right? She barely missed in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania because she only won by 2 points. So if you're a Democrat, you want Kamala Harris up 3 points nationally, right, is good. 4 points is great. And because states have that on the question of elasticity, states also have a nature relative to each other. So since 2008, the most Democratic states in the 7 swing states are what? Michigan and Nevada, top of the heap. Michigan and Nevada come in for Democrats of those states better than any of the rest. What are the least Democratic states of those 7? North Carolina, consistently 6 or 7 out of 7. They're the farthest reach for Democrats. And then Georgia and Arizona. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin occupy the 3 and 4 spot, 3 and 4 spot, 3 and 4 spot. They go back and forth. So the one other caveat I tried, people who feel like they should know but don't want to argue about Nate Cohn's forecast model, people right, who would like to basically be able to have a hunch, is if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, he will also win North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. Maybe he'll win Wisconsin. If Kamala Harris wins Arizona, she will also have won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The states do migrate over time, as we were talking about with Texas and Minnesota. They do migrate over time, but they don't 1 year to the other say, we were the most Democratic state and now we're the least Democratic state. So if the idea that you're going to put together a 270 to win map in which, well, what if we give Trump Nevada and Michigan, but Harris, Arizona, and Georgia? That's not what happens. The states, do you know why we call a bellwether a bellwether? Do you know the origin of that name?
I feel like I might have one point, but I do not remember. What is it?
So a wether is the male sheep, the older male sheep, and he wears a bell. And if you want to know where the herd is going, where the flock is going, you listen for the bell, and he is the bellwether.
I did not know that.
Is he leading the flock, or is that where the flock's going, and he happens to be at the head of it? The U's will probably say that he's just that he's just pretending, and they're really leading the flock. But the idea of a bellwether is pick a place, and you can pretty much figure out what's going to be behind it. What will the things that will be on that side of it be? And for Kamala Harris, if she wins Georgia, then it's going to be, that was one of the frustrations in 2020. So because Pennsylvania's preposterous law forbidding the counting of votes, of early votes until all of the election day votes were in, one of the dumbest, most damaging, spiteful moves that I can recall in recent political history, a recent political history loaded with that. Because of that decision, we had already called Arizona. Georgia was coming in. North Carolina was tied. The idea that Joe Biden was going to win in Arizona and Georgia and maybe North Carolina, but lose Pennsylvania was very frustrating. But we had to wait 3 or 4 days before Pennsylvania could finally get all the votes counted, and we could say what everybody knew was going to be true that week, which was, yeah, that's what happens.
So it looks like Harris is winning, is what I take from that.
Harris is winning, and Harris is winning outside the swing state shift. She's winning by 4 points or so, and that's enough, right? That's enough to not for a Democrat. If we know, so Joe Biden had an early lead and then sat on the lead. He didn't grow his vote share, but a half a point or whatever. He stayed exactly where he was he won almost no undecided, persuadable third party, maybe voters. He sat right where he was. And then Trump surged at the end. And Trump almost caught Biden, right? He almost caught Biden. If Harris did that, she would lose, right? If Harris doesn't grow her, if of that 5.7% or whatever that is persuadable or available at this point, if she only stays where she is, she'll lose. But if she gets half, just half, she'll win big. So that's basically real hardcore political people are pulling their hair out and they're saying no, but you have to look at the models and you have to look at the da 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 da. And I hear you, and I'm into it, and I fool around with it. I'm there with you, but the national polling average captures lots and lots of that stuff too. And if you want just one metric to look at, just look at the national polling average. You should subscribe to Stirewalt on Politics, delivered to your inbox each and every Saturday. And we'll put a little average in there for you, and you can track for the next 9 weeks, where does the race stand, and is the Democrat more than 2 points, more than enough of 2 points ahead in order to win in the Electoral College.
Okay, so what was the spell in Excalibur? Anal Nathrath Usast Bethud. That's all, which is to say, all I'm hearing is numerological sorcery.
Yeah.
You might as well have been Louis Farrakhan speaking at the Million Man March and talking about how the 6 is a pregnant 9 standing on its head. I do know. Do you remember that? That was.
I do.
It was
What year was the Million Man March?
Thing really blew me away. So,
what year was the Million Man March?
I want to say like 95, maybe.
Feels very Clinton era. Feels very 90s. Yeah. Feels very 90s, and that was in the previous era of mass demonstrations. We remember Hands Across America. We remember the idea that if we could just get enough people to do something and be there, then the world would have to recognize us. And as a person who hates crowds and large numbers of people, I'm very unhappy that we are back in an age where people, Donald Trump particularly, but everyone, is obsessed with who got 15,000 people to go someplace in Valdosta, Georgia, in a country of 333 million people. It really is a bummer because I like many individual people, but I definitely do not like people in large numbers.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was actually the Million Man March that was the thing that made me realize how weird I was, how much of an outlier I was politically, because all of these people, I remember Jack Kemp was just mesmerized by the size of the crowd. My old boss, Ben Wattenberg, was mesmerized by the size of the crowd. There were certain people who were just sort of like, this is amazing. And I was like, this is creepy. And it had nothing to do with race, because
No.
I had the exact same feeling about for almost any large political crowd. Anyway, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole. We can do the unwisdom of crowds spiel another time. I wanted to get to the point that, like, the mismatch between what you're saying and the punditry conversation I keep tuning into is quite enormous. And I, without casting aspersions or any of that kind of thing, from people I respect enormously to people I don't, so a wide spectrum. The amount of parsing of individual statements by Harris, the amount of look at this, oh my gosh, this video about Waltz, or this dumbass tweet by Trump, or whatever, I have to assume that at best that has the chance of affecting a very tiny number of people to change their vote, right? Because
yes,
most people, I mean, the old cliche, which I think probably still somewhat true, this is probably a little different because you had the switcheroo and all that, but most people who haven't decided how to vote don't start paying attention until Labor Day. And maybe there are some people who think they've decided how to vote who might change after Labor Day when they start paying attention. I don't know. It's possible. But like, if you have really strong opinions about Trump or Harris or Waltz or Vance, right, you know who you're voting for. And
or at least you know who you're not voting for. At least you know who you're not voting for.
That's right. And so, like, all of this, let's just picture me as Rob Lowe with a spray can of hairspray and a Bic lighter. All of this St. Elmo's fire, right? All of this there are flashes in the night, and but it's like 95% of the conversation, and I just think that there's the punditry conversation is remarkably on left and right telling voters who are already wildly plugged in stuff that I just don't think matters, right? No. The conversation is just not about, like, I don't think, I'm totally down with the idea that it matters in terms of how she would govern or how Trump would govern or what it says about America, or, price controls are stupid. Trump's becoming pro-choice. All of those kinds of things are perfectly legitimate conversations to have, and I will have them ad nauseum for the next 4 to 40 years. But in terms of, like, how this election is playing out, this all seems like a sideshow to me. So
the first to disclose against interest of my opinion, my to be sure here is, in a race that will be decided most likely by 10 or 20,000 votes in a handful of states, right? Questions about base motivation are extraordinarily important, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you're Donald Trump, do you want to antagonize pro-lifers right now who may not like you already and were voting for you, said, yes, I can do it, I can vote for Donald Trump because he brought down Roe and because he did that? Is it good to have 3 positions on a late-term abortion ban in Florida in 24 hours? Probably not helpful. Is it helpful to say that the federal government will pay or mandate that insurance companies pay for IVF with those voters and with fiscal conservatives? Yes, it's not helpful, and it moves things at the margins. So you don't want to antagonize your base, right? And you want to keep them well-fed. You want to keep pumping out stuff that keeps them engaged. Similarly for Harris. how she talks about Israel and trying to find her new footing on being both pro-Israel, trying to thread this needle of I'm pro-Israel, but anti-Netanyahu kind of thing. Who does that antagonize, right? How many voters? And if you think that Michigan's going to be a question of 10,000 votes or whatever, it's material. It's not that it's not material. But what we miss in the hyper focus on highly engaged core constituency groups is that 5.7% that we're talking about, they pay the least attention to politics of everybody. And we can talk about the effects of the switcheroo. The biggest effect of the switcheroo was that people who are going to vote for Kamala Harris were telling pollsters that they might not vote for Joe Biden. Were they telling that? Were they saying that to pollsters because they genuinely, sincerely said, I don't think I can vote for a person who is so decrepit. I don't think I can't do it. In the same way, there are a number of people who are conservative who say, I can't vote for Donald Trump. I can't do it. I have to write in Barry Goldwater. I can't do it. So what we saw with the switcheroo was, and many of those voters were oddly parked with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as, I don't know, someone else, not this. And then you switch the Democratic nominees. Kennedy loses most of his support, and it goes to Harris, bloop, right away, because those folks were not voting for Robert F. Kennedy. They were saying, I can't vote for Biden, whether that was real or whether they were trying to send a signal. And then Kennedy goes down to the last 2 points or point and a half, and those are people who were never going to vote for a Democrat. Those people, the Joe Rogan people, were never going to vote for a Democrat. And now Trump is trying to get that point and a half, and with good reason, he would very much like that point and a half to come in his direction and not vote for the Libertarian or not stay home or whatever. For most of the people in the undecided that remain, now that we have a firmed up race and Harris is running better than a generic, about as good or better than a generic Democrat, who are those people and where do they get their news? I love them because they're not sweating politics, but they're not Dispatch subscribers. They're not listening to this podcast. They're not paid subscribers of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They're not doing that because those people may be undecided about whether they'll vote for Kamala Harris or whether they'll write in Barry Goldwater or whether they will vote for Donald Trump or not vote or whatever. But the people who are in the last chunk, where do they get their news? Where do they get their information? Local TV, Instagram, reels of late night comics. They're avoiding politics. These are the unicorns. These are the most valuable voters, and billions of the many billions of dollars that will be spent this year are going to be focused on finding them and persuading them to go their way, to make it impossible for them to go the other way. If you are undecided genuinely, and we should also stipulate, many of these folks are decided, but they can't quite say what they've decided, right? Many of them are actually decided, and if the election were held today, they would be able to express a preference. But for these folks who are genuinely asking the question, will I vote for Donald John Trump, who is the best known, most divisive political figure since ever, right? He is unlike any other American politician in that he was massively famous before he ran. He is universally known, mostly disliked, and everybody has a strong opinion about him.
Right.
Are you going to vote for this person, or are you going to vote for Kamala Harris, who is an archetype, a Democratic archetype? Kevin Williamson very adroitly described what I see in Kamala Harris, which is she's like a school administrator. She's like your principal, right? She's a known archetype. And people know what they have. So if you're genuinely undecided between these two, how likely is it that you said, well, I was reading Jonah. I was listening to Jonah and Chris talk about how Pennsylvania's collar counties are likely to break this year, and I still just can't decide between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Come on.
Right. Yeah. And I shouldn't say that your point about like keeping your base fed and happy is right. I'm not saying that these things don't matter at all, but they don't necessarily matter in the way the conversation is going, right? It's just that, like, it's the punditry is all about. There seems to be a widespread assumption that, like, voters who've made up their minds are going to be changing their minds across the aisle in one way or the other. And I just don't see a lot of evidence.
It's Evan McMullanism. I don't know how large the broad elite in America is today, but let's say it's 300,000 people, right? Let's say there's 300,000 people ranging from the mayor of Spokane, Washington, to you and me, and the members of the city councils, and people who are have big jobs in corporate America, people who are in media, people who are in entertainment, these hundreds of thousands of people who once upon a time, I forget who it was that used to talk about the 25,000, who, read the New Yorker and were totally plugged in, and how through the era of stable media in television and a limited number of outlets influenced the tastes of the country. Well, we don't have a narrow elite of 25,000 anymore. We have a very broad elite of hundreds of thousands of people. Instagram influencers are part of the broad elite. The conversations we have in the broad elite imagine that we are not elites, right? We imagine somehow that we are not elites, when in fact we are part of a narrow band of Americans who are weird. We're super weird. We consume a lot of media. We spend a lot of time online. We think about these issues constantly. We wrestle with these issues. It's good and important wrestling. And it has, as you alluded to, long-term consequences in shaping the battle of ideas. Who wins is important. How they win is even more important. We could use the example of Biden and the tragedy of Joe Biden's Pyrrhic victory in the Georgia Senate runoffs in 2021. And Joe Biden, the clear takeaway for Joe Biden in 2020 was what? The Republicans won the House while you won a narrower than expected presidential victory. Message from voters: stick to the middle, bro. Keep it here. You ran as a moderate. Stay in the middle. Stay here. And then Biden gets the Senate because Trump is an orangutan and goes down to Georgia and breaks all the crockery. And he gets the Senate. Biden gets the Senate. And all of a sudden he says, actually, my mandate is to be Lyndon Johnson, which you and I debated many times. Is Joe Biden the first 100 days of Lyndon Johnson or the last 100 days? Well, we got our answer. We got our answer. We got our answer in July. He was the last 100 days of Lyndon Johnson. And the message, the way that you win matters. If Donald Trump wins after pandering on abortion and IVF and free this and free that and just sprinting to the left, if he wins, he will have incentives to govern that way. If Kamala Harris wins, right, and she wins Pennsylvania, let's say Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania, and Josh Shapiro is said that no one worked harder than Josh Shapiro to deliver Pennsylvania, and Michigan is no problem, right? She cruises in Michigan. What will Democrats conclude about Israel policy? What will they conclude about how to deal with anti-Semites on the left? So how you win or how you think you win matters a great deal. So all of this argument, all of this debate, as you say, has consequences for how people govern and what they think happened. But in terms of how that 5.7% of the electorate votes, it's vibes, brother. That is the purest vibe community. And we casted before on the question of vibes, but I'm a vibe defender in this way. People make snap judgments that are often quite good. People often, the Malcolm Gladwell theory and Blink and all of that stuff. People do elections like flashcards. You hold them up. Is it this one or is it this one? And people make a conclusion. They say, I like that one. Why do you like it? And this is one of the many problems with issue polling in elections. If I have concluded that I will vote for Kamala Harris, if you then ask me how I think she's doing on questions, look at the question of Kamala Harris on the economy and on inflation in the most recent Wall Street Journal poll compared to Joe Biden. Are her policies different? No, right. Not particularly. I don't think that the idea that the Federal Trade Commission is going to be able to effectively set the price of eggs was what made people say, I think, but she improved over Biden by more than double digits. And on these questions is now 6 or 8 points behind Trump instead of 20 points where Biden was trailing. Why? Because people decided they were going to vote for her and then post facto say, yeah, I prefer her on the economy. Yeah, I prefer her on the border. Yeah, I prefer her on this. So the reason is the servant of the passions. And when our vibes move us in a direction politically, we fill in what's behind that with motivated reasoning.
All right, the road calls for me.
Yes,
it may be a siren song, but I must key to the byways and highways. I will say one of the great things about we're staying. I'm a little loath to tell you the name of the app because it talk about making snap judgments. But there are these various
Grindr,
apps.
Jonah?
No, I'm traveling with my wife. Sir.
I'm meeting a lot of people. It's great out here. This app is great. I'm meeting all kinds of people.
No, there's an app called Hip Camp.
Oh boy.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like a lot of people, and there are a bunch of different services that do this where you don't go to an RV camp. Again, my wife has views on these things. You don't go to an RV camp. You don't go to a COA thing on the side of the road. It's more like someone's farm or vineyard or that kind of thing. And they have spaces, somewhere between 1 and 5 or 10.
Oh, nice.
And you hang out on their spot. And the nice thing about it is, like, as you know, I have driven on interstates a gazillion times. And the nice thing about this model is it forces you to answer the question, I wonder what this place looks like when you get off the interstate. And so we drove through, and I want to be really clear about this. I've driven past an enormous amount of corn in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, just a lot of corn. But there's a lot of corn that hugs the interstates. When you get off the roads in Wisconsin and Kansas and Nebraska, there's more corn. There's so much more corn.
You've only scratched the surface of corn and soybeans. You've only begun to see the splendor.
Sorry, I gotta get back on the road. I'll put a pin in this because I want to talk to you more about the point you were getting at the end about, like, I think mandate, and I don't mean the magazine whose classifieds got destroyed by Grindr. I mean political mandates are basically bullshit in American politics. We'll bleep that. But conventional wisdom matters a hell of a lot. Like the interpretations of elections matters enormously for how parties and politicians respond or don't respond. And
it's not what happened, it's what you think happened. It's not what happened.
Right.
It's what you think happened. And mandates, I should just say, in defense of mandates, that mandates are real in re-elections, right? They're very real in re-elections. Ronald Reagan didn't win in 1980. Jimmy Carter lost. But in 1984, Ronald Reagan won, and he had a mandate to finish his work.
To be Ronald Reagan.
to be Ronald Reagan. He had a mandate to be himself. And unfortunately, you and I have talked about this many times, the mandates are too easy now, which is all you have to be is not the other person. And you fulfill that on day one. And that's not good enough. That's one of the many toxins of negative partisanship.
All right, my friend, thank you for putting up with the, I don't know why I lost internet connection a few times. I think the satellites have just moved into the wrong place or something. But thank you for putting up with me. And I've lost the connection again. I'm going to keep talking as if you're still here. Thank you for putting up with me. I don't know why we've lost all these connections, but it seems to be deteriorating. And obviously, we'll only have you back on, 15 to 20 times between now and the election.
It's entirely my pleasure. I'm glad to see your face. I hope no one is murdered or murders one another out there. And please to enjoy Steve Hayes's beloved Wisconsin.
I'll do my best. Thank you, sir.